Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really glad you joined us this week. This is a follow-up episode to the one we did last week around the Battle of Gettysburg, and that was one of our better episodes in a while, and we've had a lot of great feedback from that one. And a lot of people coming to us and asking us to do more battle episodes, and so that's what we're going to do this week. This week, we're actually going to look at an entire campaign that was put on by General Grant on behalf of President Lincoln. And Ulysses S. Grant, as many of you might know, was consumed through most of the war out in the Western Front. And he was actually working out there and had a couple of big battle victories, whereas the Army of the Potomac was working on the Eastern Front. And Army Potomac had many different commanders, most of whom Lincoln was very disappointed with, and often would lose to General Lee on the Confederate side. And so coming out of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, of course, this was a huge Union victory. They pushed the Confederates back into Virginia. The end of 1863, there were a couple of skirmishes, but there wasn't a whole lot going on at the end of that year. And for the most part, both sides just reconstituted, re-equipped, licked their wounds, try to get their arms together, retrain new troops that were coming in to fill some of the dead and wounded from previous battles. So heading into 1864, Lincoln was obviously excited about several of the victories that it had in 1863, but he really wanted to end the war. He wanted to finish off the Confederacy. It was an election year. He was running for re-election. And so he wanted to find his guy, and he felt like he had finally found that guy in General Ulysses S. Grant, who had been a winner throughout the war. So he brought him in, made him the supreme commander of all of the forces of the U.S. Army, and asked Grant to devise a strategy to finally put an end to the war and finally destroy Lee and his troops, his Army of Northern Virginia. So starting in February of 1864, Grant took over the federal forces. He started a planning activity which went on for about 2 months through March and April of that year. They put together a strategy instead of most of the war where they had been trying to defeat the Confederates on the battlefield, but then hold land and actually be in a holding pattern and take property. This time they didn't want to do that. They wanted to pursue the Confederates everywhere they went, all throughout Virginia, and really force the issue, even if it was a bloody affair and even if they got into a lot of different battles. The Union was okay with that because they knew that essentially they couldn't end this war unless they whittled down Lee and his troops. So they really did change strategies from a hold land strategy to a pursue the Confederate strategy. And so what Grant did was he brought in a lot of his top generals. You had Sheridan, you had Meade, you had other generals who had been operating out in the Western Front since he left it, that all came in to help with this planning effort and get ready for this big campaign, which was called the Overland Campaign. And that's what we'll be talking about today, the Overland Campaign. And we'll be looking at what the Overland Campaign was, which lasted for about 40 days. And we'll be talking about all the different detailed battles that happened during those 40 days as Grant made his way down through Virginia on his way to Petersburg and then eventually to Richmond. So obviously Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy, Lee and his troops were going to defend Richmond at all costs. And they did that throughout this battle. Every time there was a battle down through Virginia, they found a way to make sure they were in between Grant and Richmond so that they were always in that defensive position. Lee and his men had learned their lesson from Gettysburg the year before, where they tried their first offensive battle and lost. For most of the war, the Confederacy was very good at engaging the Union, but then digging in, entrenching themselves in defensive positions and winning defensive battles. And so Lee clearly in 1864 learned the lesson of Gettysburg and went back to his defensive posture. And you'll see in each of the battles that we're going to study as part of the Overland Campaign, he did just that. He made sure he was always in position against Grant at each of these battle stops and dug in and was in defensive position and could do the best he could to defend. So that's what happened in the Overland Campaign. After we go over a little bit of the Overland Campaign, we're going to go through a quick video. We're going to talk about it when we get back. And then after that, we're actually going to look at the Overland Campaign battle map, where we're going to actually go through each of the individual battles as Grant made his way down through Virginia on his way south. And then after that, we'll talk about, as always in this program, our 25 interesting facts about the Overland Campaign. There was a lot of really interesting things that happened. Not many people know about this campaign, but it was towards the end of the war, and it really pretty much finished off the Confederate ability to defend Petersburg and Richmond, which were both key strategic places. So we'll talk about that 25 interesting facts, and hopefully you'll learn a lot about things that maybe you didn't know about this campaign. So let's talk about the Overland Campaign, also known as Grant's Overland Campaign, or in some history books they call it the Wilderness Campaign. It was a series of battles fought in Virginia during May and June of 1864, as we mentioned, toward the end of the American Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant, who was the general-in-chief of the Union armies as of February that year, took over and directed actions of the Army of Potomac. So even though he made Meade head of the Army of Potomac, Grant went with that Army of Potomac into Virginia and supervised and made sure the strategy was being directed. Essentially, George Meade and the other Confederate generals on the other side were battling each other before that and knew each other very well. As they crossed into Virginia to start the Overland Campaign, Lee knew exactly where the Union troops were, and they were met almost immediately after crossing the river as they entered Virginia, and they met in what was called the Wilderness Battle. And that Wilderness Battle went on for a couple of days. It was very bloody fighting. Some of the men who actually got injured in that campaign ended up dying in a huge fire blaze that started because of all the cannon fire and other action that was happening. It was a really tragic situation. Some of the injured who had been injured were not able to escape and actually got burned up in the fire. So we'll talk some more about that. So crossing the river on May 4th of 1864, Grant sought to defeat Lee's army by quickly placing forces between Lee and Richmond. And that was his idea, was to outflank the Confederate Army. Lee surprised Grant by attacking that army during that Battle of the Wilderness, as I mentioned before, resulting in many casualties on both sides. It was a very bloody affair, the Wilderness Battle. Happened from May 5th to May 7th. Unlike his predecessors in the Eastern Theater, however, Grant did not withdraw his army following the loss. And this was definitely a difference. Many times Lee would whip Union generals previously, and they would retreat and go and regroup for a couple of days and then maybe come back or maybe not, maybe try to march somewhere else. In this case, Grant did not allow that. He said, we're never giving up, and we're going to be battling Lee all the way through to Richmond. So essentially, since he did not withdraw, they made another attempt to go a little bit further south. And they went to a place that had already had a major battle several years before, and that was Spotsylvania. They ended up meeting at the Spotsylvania courthouse, where both sides dug in, the Union and the Confederate side. Confederates on the side protecting the path to Richmond, and then Unions on the other side. That battle was incredibly tedious for both sides because it ended up lasting almost 2 weeks of entrenched warfare. Some sides attacking the other a little bit here and there, but for the most part, kind of waiting each other out and waiting for a strategic advantage. Eventually, after that, Battle of Spotsylvania, where Grant did repeatedly attack the Confederate defensive line multiple times, hoping for a breakthrough, was unable to make that breakthrough. And so after 2 weeks, essentially gave up that spot and kept moving south, just like he had done with the Wilderness. And the third battle that they found themselves in was the Battle of North Anna River, which happened May 23rd through 26th. It was a 3-day battle. Here, Lee had clever defensive positions that provided an opportunity to defeat portions of Grant's army, but an illness from Lee during that battle, this was the first time he had been sick the entire Civil War. He actually got sick, and it allowed Grant and his troops to escape what was really a bad kind of pincher position they were in against that river. Essentially, this Confederates possibly could have made major damage on Grant's forces. But because Lee got sick, everything kind of stopped and paused for a day and let the Union get out of their situation they were in during that 3-day battle. And so they continued to push south, continued to probe the Confederate lines, probe to see if there's any way through. Every time the Confederates always had an answer. They always seemed to be in the right position, were dug in, building groundworks everywhere that they went and making sure that the Union didn't have any path to get to Richmond. The next battle on the list going south was the Battle of Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor is in what's currently today Mechanicsville, Virginia, which is just between 8 and 10 miles north of Richmond. So they were getting very close to Richmond proper. Cold Harbor was an incredibly bloody affair. The Confederates had already dug in at Cold Harbor. They had groundworks that stretched for over 2 miles across that battlefield. And the Union, when they got there, tried to attack multiple times, but when they weren't unsuccessful, they also dug in. And Cold Harbor ended up lasting also almost 2 weeks, just like Appomattox. Towards the end of that battle, Grant and his generals were getting a little frustrated, and they tried a charge similar to Lee's charge that they had done in the Confederate side up in Gettysburg. The Union tried a charge and ended up getting absolutely slaughtered against the Confederate groundworks and defensive positions at Cold Harbor. And they lost about 7,000 men within a couple of hours. So it really was interesting to see that Grant made this mistake, very similar to what Lee had done up in Gettysburg. But his army was large enough that he could sustain such a loss. It was interesting. Grant, in his memoirs after he retired after his presidency, mentioned that the one action he wished he could take back from the Civil War was his request for that charge at Cold Harbor. He thought that was the worst mistake he had made tactically and strategically. So he would take that one back if he could. After that battle, the Confederates essentially held. The Union continued to move south. They had multiple battles along the James River. They had multiple skirmishes along the Rappahannock River, continued to move south. And eventually, after many, many days, 40 total of battles, the Union broke out and finally made their way all the way to Petersburg, which is a very strategic site. It was a site where the Confederates stored a lot of their equipment and weapons and ammunition and cannon. And it was a place that the Union was very much trying to take on their way to Richmond. So they wanted to sweep down around Petersburg, take Petersburg, and then turn back north towards Richmond. The Confederates again beat them to Petersburg, set up defensive positions, and what ended up ensuing after that situation was a 9-month siege where the Union surrounded Petersburg for 9 months, and there were major cannon battles back and forth many times over those 9 months. There was negotiations. There was situations where the Confederates from the outside had to break in to bring supplies to their men inside the siege. So it was a very difficult situation for the Confederates. Eventually, much of the Army of Northern Virginia ended up having to surrender at Petersburg, and that really broke the spirit of the Army. The Union took that 9-month time to restock and resupply and bring in reinforcements and get ready for their major push into Richmond. So Petersburg was kind of, in a way, the Confederates' last stand before the Union got a chance to go into Richmond and essentially end the war. So this 9-month siege, there's a whole great number of books out there and lots of great information around this 9-month siege if you'd like to take a look at it. Really an interesting situation that happened there in Petersburg. So that was a little bit about the Overland Campaign. 40 days of absolute hell on earth is what they called it. The amount of dead and wounded surpassed any other major period in the war. This was Grant's last attempt to try to end the war. He took the orders from President Lincoln during this election year, and he pushed in and decided it didn't matter if he won the battle or lost the battle, he was going to continue on, continue to resupply, continue to bring in reinforcements and push and push and push, knowing that eventually the Confederates were going to break because they just didn't have the manpower or the equipment that the North had. So let's go ahead and take a look at a video, and we'll come back on the other side and talk about it.
1864. The Civil War enters its 4th year. Although Union armies have made significant inroads in Tennessee and the Mississippi Valley, battle lines remain relatively unchanged in Virginia. last, Lincoln finds a general who will fight. Ulysses S. Grant is appointed commander of all Union armies. He determines upon a simple but novel strategy. Advance simultaneously with all his forces on key enemy centers. Grant makes his headquarters with his largest force, the Army of the Potomac, a well-fed, well-supplied, and well-rested army that was ready for the coming ordeal. Confederate General Robert E. Lee understood the realities. His army of Northern Virginia is outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. Supplies are scarce. Obliged to conserve resources, he must fight a defensive war. With luck, his undaunted army will hold back Yankee invaders until fall presidential elections can potentially change the political landscape. The Union Army breaks camp on the evening of May 3rd. The men on both sides have little concept of the horror that lies ahead. The fighting in the coming weeks will kill and wound more of them than at any other time in American history. Grant will operate against Lee's right flank, using coastal waterways to establish and supply his army as it moves. But to carry out this plan, Grant has to advance into the fabled wilderness, a 70-square-mile tract of dense woods and thickets, poorly mapped, with few roads. Its thickets will neutralize Union superiority in numbers and artillery. Grant hopes he can get through it before Lee reacts. Lee does not allow this to happen. He sees that Grant's right is vulnerable and moves with Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps on Orange Turnpike and A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps on the Plank Road. James Longstreet's corps, recently arrived from East Tennessee, has greater distance to cover. Morning, May 5th. Armies collide on both thoroughfares as the struggle develops into 2 distinct battles, separated by trackless wilderness. Governor Warren's 5th and John Sedgwick's 6th Corps go into position on the right, centered about a clearing called Saunders Field, while Hancock's 2nd Corps occupies the strategic Brock Road intersection. Bitter but inconclusive fighting rages until dark. Grant prepares to deliver a decisive blow come morning. Meanwhile, the Confederates, exhausted and disorganized, anxiously await Longstreet's arrival. The Union attack begins at 5 a.m. Warren and Sedgwick are quickly contained on the turnpike. Hancock crushes a ragged Confederate line on Plank Road, and the day appears lost for Lee. Longstreet's arrival turns the tide as his brigades press Hancock back, but Longstreet is badly wounded at a critical moment. His attack loses momentum. Lee pauses and strikes again on the Brock Road. The fighting rages, but determined Union counterattacks drive the rebels back. Later that afternoon, Georgian John B. Gordon launches a vigorous attack on Sedgwick's exposed right flank, capturing many prisoners. But darkness ends the affair before further damage can be done. The fighting causes the dry woods to catch fire. Many wounded men perish in the flames. Both sides fortify their positions. Earthworks and trenches scar the landscape for miles. Stalemate ensues. Soldiers are exhausted. Nearly 30,000 have been killed, wounded, or captured. This 3-day fight in the wilderness is the 4th bloodiest battle of the war up to that time. Both commanders have learned something about each other. Grant discovers Lee's army is more formidable than any opponent he has faced. Open flanks led to embarrassing reversals. Grant will ensure that this does not happen again during this campaign. Lee realizes his opponent is a man of different character. Grant is not retreating as his predecessors had. Instead, Grant pushes southward toward the crucial crossroads at Spotsylvania Courthouse. Union morale skyrockets. Grant is continuing the advance on Richmond. Warren's 5th Corps is leading the advance, slowed by Confederate cavalry. Warren reaches a clearing near Spotsylvania called Laurel Hill, but Lee has won the race to the crossroads. The path ahead is blocked by Joseph B. Kershaw's veteran division. Confederate forces quickly dig in, creating a formidable defensive position. George Meade, Army of the Potomac commander, orders Sedgwick's 6th Corps to support Warren in the attack on the Confederate position at Laurel Hill. It does not go well. Delays and ultimately concentrated rebel fire halts the attack. As the balance of the armies come up, the battle lines extend for miles. Both sides dig in and prepare for the upcoming ordeal. Union Cavalry Commander Philip Sheridan cuts loose on a raid towards Richmond. Grant hopes this move will force Confederate cavalry hero Jeb Stuart into a showdown battle with Sheridan, the competent Yankee newcomer. 3 days later at Yellow Tavern, Sheridan found his path blocked by Stuart. A sharp skirmish ensues. Jeb Stuart is mortally wounded and dies the next day. Heavy skirmishing continues throughout May 9th as Union soldiers probe the surrounding wilderness, trying to determine the position of Lee's army. Union General Sedgwick, beloved commander of the 6th Corps, is killed, the victim of a sharpshooter's bullet. Grant has received reinforcements in the form of Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps. He orders Burnside to advance on Spotsylvania along the Fredericksburg Road. This forces Lee to bend back his right flank, creating a vulnerable bulge in his lines, dubbed the Mule Shoe. Meanwhile, Lee entrenches his line and continues to improve it. Confederate artillery is positioned to pour crossfire upon any attacking column. After Sedgwick's death, Horatio Wright assumes command over the 6th Corps. He spies a weak point in the Confederate line and orders Colonel Emory Upton to exploit it. With 12 hand-picked regiments, the carefully planned attack advances in lines 4 regiments deep. It's an innovative idea. Upton's men burst out of trees a mere 200 yards from the rebel works and pour through the lines of the shocked Confederates. In desperate fighting, nearly 1,000 rebels are captured, but the Yankees get no support. Confederate reinforcements force Upton's attackers to retreat, abandoning their dead and wounded. Although a failure, this sort of attack was revolutionary in concept and execution. It will be used again. Heavy skirmishing continues along the line on May 11th, as both Grant and Lee plan their next moves. As his target, Grant selects the Mule Shoe. The attack is scheduled for early the next morning, May 12th. Throughout the day and well into the evening, Union troops move into position. Meanwhile, Lee uncharacteristically misinterprets Grant's intentions. He thinks Grant is about to retreat and removes key artillery pieces from the Mule Shoe. modeled upon Upton's charge, a massive Union attack, spearheaded by Winfield Scott Hancock's veteran Second Corps, roll over the Confederate line. 5,000 rebels are captured, including 2 generals and numerous cannons. In desperate straits, Lee coordinates a series of counterattacks that drive Union forces back. The entire line was recaptured, except at the angle of the Bulge, or Mule Shoe itself, ever after christened the Bloody Angle. Here, a bitter struggle ensues as Union forces desperately cling to their limited gains against repeated Confederate counterattacks. The soldiers fight at point-blank range, with only a few feet between them. The battle rages along a narrow front. After 18 hours of constant combat, the Confederates withdraw to a hastily constructed reserve line. The 2 armies are exhausted after 7 days of intense fighting. Stymied, Grant proposes to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. Over the next week, the battle lines pivot southward, but Grant resolves to break off the action at this point. Spotsylvania would emerge as the 3rd bloodiest battle of the Civil War. In a bold move, Grant quits the field, hoping to turn Lee's right flank again and make for Richmond. Lee, however, knows his intentions and races for the North Anna River, 20 miles to the south. Arriving on May 22nd, Lee establishes a strong blocking position on a series of commanding bluffs south of the river. Grant reaches the North Anna on May 23rd and begins crossing that very day, testing the rebel lines. Several days of indecisive fighting follow as Grant realizes the formidable nature of Lee's position. It's a trap, designed to force Grant to split his army into pieces where it can be defeated in detail. Grant withdraws across the river and once again advances around the Confederate right flank in search of an opportunity to catch Lee's veterans in the open, away from field fortifications. On the North Anna line, Lee has missed his best opportunity of striking a decisive blow. Lee knows that he must stop Grant before he reaches the Richmond area. If not, Grant will besiege the Confederate capital, and the city's demise would be a mere question of time. Grant cuts loose from the line at North Anna and sweeps southeast, closer to Richmond. The armies are back on familiar turf, ground of McClellan's campaign 2 years previous. The opposing forces clash on a front that stretches several miles along Totopotomoy Creek. By the 1st of June, Grant has pivoted around Richmond, and his soldiers seize the strategic crossroads at Old Cold Harbor. Fighting erupts near sundown, but the results are inconclusive. Grant, sensing an opportunity to crush Lee, orders the attack renewed at dawn. He awaits the arrival of significant reinforcements, William F. Smith's 18th Corps from Butler's Army of the James, operating south of Richmond. But reinforcements require additional time. The attack is postponed 24 hours until June 3rd. It is a fatal delay. Confederates use the time to consolidate and fortify their positions. Now, masters of the art, Lee's veterans erect elaborate earthworks with well-sighted artillery positions, creating deadly crossfires. Dawn, June 3rd. The 2nd, 6th, and 18th Corps assault the Confederate lines on a broad front and are repulsed with staggering losses. Confederate General Evander Law said, "It wasn't war, it was murder." For Grant's part, he wrote, "I always regretted the second attack at Cold Harbor." Once more, the two armies are in stalemate. Grant is unwilling to admit defeat and plans future operations. Meanwhile, conditions on the field are unbearably inhumane. No truce is declared to bury dead or recover wounded lying between opposing forces. Cutting railroads would isolate Richmond from the Deep South. Grant decides to take the war across the James River and strike Richmond from the south via the railroad center at Petersburg. Fooled, Lee fails to see his enemy's intentions, and Grant withdraws from the Cold Harbor line unmolested by Confederates. Union forces are reinvigorated by the mere sight of the James River. The horrors of the wilderness lay far behind. Most cross the wide river on lengthy pontoon bridges, an engineering feat thought to be impossible by many. The Overland Campaign is over. There had never been such a bloodletting upon this continent. From the Rapidan to the James River, the butcher's bill was more than 80,000 men killed, wounded, and missing. All in less than 6 weeks. Contrary to popular opinion, both commanding generals displayed both brilliance and poor judgment. Grant fights his way to the gates of Richmond. Lee becomes pinned in the Richmond and Petersburg defenses. The Army of Northern Virginia has been staggered, but not destroyed. Lee, however, is unable to replace those lost, and his army will not recover from the recent ordeals. But his soldiers, man for man, have proven more than a match for Grant. The war enters a new phase in the more open country south of the James River. The fortified lines and breastworks extend for miles around Richmond and Petersburg. Lee's prophecy comes true. Grant crosses the James, besieges Richmond, and 10 months later, forces the demise of the Confederate capital, the Army of Northern Virginia, and ultimately, the Confederacy itself.
So as you can see there's so many things to talk about coming out of that video. The first one being that if you think about it, Grant and Lee were the two most famous generals on either side, and yet they hadn't faced each other yet. It was 4 years into the war. Grant had been fighting in the West, Lee in the East. This was like a heavyweight matchup. This matchup had to come. And as you can see, both of them had many successes and both of them had some failures during these 40 days that were the Overland Campaign. Both of them made critical mistakes. Both of them made some brilliant moves as well. Essentially, Lee was thinking all along that this is life and death for us. We have to protect Richmond or the war is over. Just like when he was trying to deal the death blow when he went to Pennsylvania to battle the Union during Gettysburg. This was essentially Grant's big push. This was his one opportunity to try to end the war. And as you see, it took a long time to do so, both the 40-day Overland Campaign, the 9 months siege in Petersburg, and then eventually an even longer siege of Richmond. And eventually the war did come to an end. And essentially Lee and his men were unable to replace the men that had died over the last 2 years. They just ran out of men, ran out of equipment, ran out of ability to battle the Union. And the war was over. As you can see, this 40 days really shocked the conscience of both the North and the South. People started actually turning against the war effort after these 40 days. There were many articles written up in Northern newspapers that this had to stop, this bloodletting, this murder on both sides. There had to be some way to get out of this and end the hostilities. So really both sides, newspapers, and really especially the Northern side, were starting to really lose faith in this war, and they really wanted it to be over with. You can see some of the technical aspects that happened there during the first couple of battles of this particular campaign. You had Longstreet get wounded and taken off the battlefield at the Wilderness. So just within the first 3 days of this campaign, he was essentially taken out and had to be replaced by one of his top lieutenants. You also had Jeb Stuart get killed in a cavalry battle. He was the eyes and ears of Lee throughout the entire 4.5 years that Jeb Stuart was involved in the war. So that was a huge loss. All of a sudden, their major cavalry general and the eyes and ears of the Army was out of commission because he was killed. You had a couple of Union generals also killed during these skirmishes. So just very costly for both sides. And as you saw there, this was the first time Lee had faced a Union general that refused to retreat, no matter how many times he lost a battle, and he lost several in this campaign. Grant would just pull back for a day or two, reconstitute his men, get some reinforcements from Washington, let the men get some rest, get some food. He would re-equip them, and then he would send them right back into the next one. And that was very interesting for Lee and a challenge because most of the Union generals he would whip would retreat. And same thing on the other side. Grant was not used to, in the battles that he was winning out west, he wasn't used to any Confederate generals being as tough as Lee was. He was used to them kind of buckling and pulling back and eventually retreating. And same thing in this situation. He had never faced somebody this tough before in Lee. They knew each other very well, obviously both having gone to West Point together, having fought together in the Mexican-American War, followed each other's careers all the way through. They knew each other well, and they knew each other's tactics well. And so even so, they were still surprised at how tough each of them fought on those battlefields in that 40-day campaign. So those are some of the major things I wanted to point to you there. The other thing I'd mention in those 40 days, there were the most deaths in the entire war, entire 5 years. It was truly hell on earth, truly a bloodletting that shocked the conscience of the entire nation. Cold Harbor and Spotsylvania and the Wilderness, those three battles in particular, were very lengthy, drawn out. In each of those cases, 2 weeks in length, and many, many dead on both sides. And it was just a real tragedy that this had to happen. So that's a little bit about that video. Let's go ahead and take a look at the battle map. And then we're going to go ahead and share with you some interesting facts about the battle. So you can see from this battle map what kind of distances these armies were having to travel. The Union side, of course, crossed over here on May 5th and 6th, and the first battle ensued 5th and 6th up in the Wilderness. This is the top of Virginia, right near the Potomac River. This first action was incredibly bloody, and as you saw in the video, there were some men who were wounded who actually died in the blaze and fires that happened because of all the cannon fire that was going on at the Wilderness battle. So that was really a brutal affair. After that, the Union, of course, came down this little turnpike here into the Spotsylvania courthouse, thinking that they would get to the courthouse before the Confederates would. These two sides, of course, had fought each other before at Spotsylvania some years earlier. So Lee kind of knew exactly what was going on, and he had his troops come and actually reach the Spotsylvania courthouse before Grant did, and got into entrenched defensive positions. And this also was an incredibly bloody battle. As you see, it went over 2 weeks that both sides were going at each other, and it ended up in a stalemate. So then Grant continued to come down south. He continued to probe the lines. He would try 2 different avenues, as you can see here, all the way down until the next major battle, which was at the North Anna River. Lee again outflanked him and outpositioned him and got his men in place on the other side of the North Anna River to protect Richmond, and were there and waiting on them to come. And essentially the Confederates won that battle pretty handily, and Grant kind of limped out of there, continuing coming south. Lee following, and they met again here at the Totopotomoy Creek. And as you saw, that was another battle that happened right next to the creek. And Union troops were always trying to find ways to probe and get through and break the lines. In each of these cases, they couldn't do it. But as you can see there with Totopotomoy Creek, they were only about 15 miles away from Richmond at this point. So they limped out of there again, came down to Cold Harbor. The Confederates beat them there actually only by 3 hours, and were entrenching and building ditches by the time the Union got there. When the Union got there, they actually started entrenching as well. They tried several early attacks, were rebuffed, and both sides entrenched in for what amounted to another 2 weeks of battles at Cold Harbor. And actually, I have a colleague who actually used to live actually right next to the Cold Harbor battlefield. He said it's really an impressive place. If you ever get a chance to go visit, really a fun visit there. There's a museum. There's an old tavern that they preserved. There's still people there that like to go across that field and take metal detectors and try to discover and find bullets and other shrapnel and other things that might come from that particular war. So there's still people that are finding things. So after that bloody Battle of Cold Harbor happened, the Union continued to move south. And as you can see, they did a real sweeping movement here and came all the way down across City Point and down into Petersburg. And Petersburg, of course, the Confederates already had an entrenched defense for that particular facility that they were guarding there, and that ended up in a siege of an entire 9 months from June 1864 to April 2nd, 1865, when they finally broke through. There were other cavalry battles and other smaller battles here, as you can see, that happened at Fort Harrison and New Market Heights and several other places. Yellow Tavern was another place there was a cavalry battle. But essentially, the ones that we just mentioned were the major battles that happened all the way down the line over the 40 days until they reached Petersburg and started the siege. So that's a little bit about the map, and you can see the map actually behind me in this shot. Really fascinating to study all the different skirmishes, wars, battles, and things that happened along the lines. As you saw, the Union tried everything they could to get to Richmond early, were unable to do so, were rebuffed, and it wasn't until they actually broke Petersburg when they actually gained the advantage and could go all the way into Richmond. Let's take a look at the 25 interesting facts about the Overland Campaign, and we'll come back and talk about it. Number one, Grant wanted to end the war with his strategic campaign push towards the Confederate capital of Richmond, called the Overland Campaign, also known as the Wilderness Campaign, and it was a Union offensive launched in May 1864, intended to defeat Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and bring an end to the American Civil War. The campaign, designed by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, was the bloodiest of the war. Despite losing several battles and suffering higher casualties, the campaign was a strategic Union victory. Grant successfully reduced the insurrection to a war of attrition, which the South was unable to win. So, as always, and throughout most of the war, the Confederates won almost all the battles. And in this Overland Campaign, the Confederates actually won most of the battles in this one as well. But essentially, they were unable to replace men that they were losing. And so this was Grant's major advantage, and his strategy was, we're going to wear down the Confederates until they can't fight anymore. Number two, change in Union tactics from holding land to chasing rebels. We talked about this a little bit earlier, that this was a very big change. The Union before this had been trying to fight battles and then try to hold towns. And they abandoned that in this case. This was all about chasing the Confederate Army and whittling down the Confederate Army until they got to Petersburg. So on March 10th, 1864, President Abraham Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of the Armies of the United States. Grant brought with him his successors from the Western theater of the war and a reputation for doggedness Lincoln was seeking. Unlike previous Union generals, Grant was tenacious. And as you might have heard in the Gettysburg episode, if you watch that, a lot of people throughout the countryside called Grant a butcher. He really got that reputation. Upon his arrival in Washington, Grant drafted a plan to get various Union armies in the field to act in concert, to essentially bring all the armies together and all work together in one big effort. He also devised his Overland Campaign to invade East Central Virginia. Unlike previous campaigns into that area, Grant's focused on defeating Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia rather than capturing or occupying geographic locations. Grant instructed General George Meade, who commanded the Army of Potomac, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." So that was the most famous quote from the Overland Campaign. He essentially wanted Meade to go everywhere that the Army of Northern Virginia went. Grant realized that with his superior resources that he had at his disposal, he could lose the war of attrition as long as Union forces persistently engaged the rebel army. Number three, Union troops were consistently on the move, then entrenching for battle. So Grant had his men marching and then battling Lee's army by entrenching themselves with rapidly dug groundworks as fortifications. Lee and his men did the same thing, and the troops would dig in for a day or two. The Union would attack, and then the skirmish would end, and the Union would continue to move south, looking for weak places in the southern lines to try to cross over and make a rapid march towards Richmond. This was another big change. If you really studied Civil War history in the first couple of years of the battles, both sides would actually just fight each other out in the open. This would be line against line, cannon against cannon, cavalry against cavalry. And they learned very heavily in 1863, 1864 to use earthworks and entrenching themselves to try to lower the number of casualties. And it actually did work quite a bit. Both armies had gotten very good at digging a trench. As an example, the Confederate Army and Union Army both dug a 2-mile trench on either side at Cold Harbor in 24 hours. So you can imagine the amount of manpower it takes to build a trench that large in just a day. Number 4, casualties were some of the highest of the war over the 40-day campaign. Kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you're comparing this to a 1-day or a 2-day or a 3-day battle, if you measure up those casualties across 40 days, you're obviously going to get a lot more. And in this case, you can see there was a total casualties among both sides of almost 100,000 men. So this was just incredibly bloody 40 days and brutal, really more for the Confederates because they didn't have the men to replace. Previous years had involved battles and long breaks in between to recover. And this was the campaign idea of sustained action. It was a new approach engineered by Grant. So if you think about it, if you look at 1861, 62, 63, the Confederates and the Union would fight maybe 3 or 4 major battles each year and then take several months off in between to reorganize their men, lick their wounds, get more equipment, get more weapons, upgrade their cannons, and then get ready for another battle. And that's how most of the war went. But this was the first time in 1864 that the Union devised this plan where they weren't going to give the Confederates any rest in between. It was going to be battle every single day until they won the War of Attrition. Number 5, Battle of the Wilderness, which started May 5th and ended May 7th. And that was 1864. Grant launched the Overland Campaign when the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, occupying an area locally known as the Wilderness. The Wilderness was a tangled area of dense forest and undergrowth that had hampered the maneuverability of federal forces during previous Union defeats at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Major George Meade commanded the Army of the Potomac, but as General-in-Chief of the Armies, Grant accompanied Meade's army in the field so he could supervise overall campaign operations. Essentially, Grant, instead of trying to maintain this operation strategically from Washington with Lincoln from afar, he wanted to be right in the field and right in the thick of it, helping with decisions. He hoped to use the wilderness to screen his operations and move around the Confederate Army. And he also planned to pass through it before the Confederates impeded him. Hoping to see history repeat itself, Confederate General Robert E. Lee hastened to engage the Federals before they could escape the wilderness. On May 5th and 6th, the two armies met along 2 plank roads that passed through the tangled forest. The Battle of the Wilderness was one of the most gruesome engagements of the war, as raging fires in the thick undergrowth burned many of the wounded soldiers to death. When the battle ended, Grant had suffered the same fate as Pope and Hooker before him. Lee had inflicted about 18,000 casualties on Meade's army while suffering only about 7,800 himself. So really, if you look at it, just pure casualty-wise, the Confederates were highly successful. Number 6, race to Spotsylvania courthouse. Lee recognized the critical consequences of allowing Grant to position Meade's army between his army and Richmond. Thus, on May 8th, the race was on to Spotsylvania. Unfortunately for the Federals, the rebels reached the community first, enabling them to establish superior defensive positions. From May 8th through May 21st, the two armies built networks of complex trenches and engaged in a series of give-and-take battles around Spotsylvania that again resulted in high casualties. On May 12th and 13th, a Union attack at a place known as Bloody Angle, and you saw that in the video. There was this bulge that was sticking out in the Confederates' line that the Union could attack from both sides, and that became known as the Bloody Angle. It nearly split Lee's army in half, but the Confederates regrouped and repulsed the Federals in a fight that continued for nearly 20 hours. Unable to break Lee's lines, Grant disengaged once more and ordered Meade to move his army south on May 21st, ending the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. And you'll see there's a marker there on the left side talking about the race for Spotsylvania, and also a picture of the two sides fully entrenched just outside the Spotsylvania courthouse. Number 7, the Battle of Yellow Tavern. This was on May 11th. This is a one-day battle. Hoping to cause confusion among the Confederates during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, Grant dispatched Major General Philip Sheridan and his cavalry corps on a raid of Southern communication and supply lines near Richmond. Lee immediately sent General Jeb Stuart and his cavalry in pursuit. On May 11th, the rebels intercepted the Federals at Yellow Tavern, Virginia. Union soldiers outnumbered the Confederates and forced them to retreat following a spirited engagement. During the Battle of Yellow Tavern, Union Private John A. Huff dealt Confederacy a substantial blow when he mortally wounded Jeb Stuart with his .44 caliber revolver. Stuart died the next day, May 12, 1864, leaving a sizable void in the Army of Northern Virginia's leadership. And we mentioned some of the generals who were killed or injured in this particular campaign. This one was probably the biggest one of all for the Confederates. They really couldn't afford to lose Jeb Stuart and his cavalry that were the eyes and ears of their army overall. Number 8, Battle of North Anna. We mentioned this coming out of the video. This was May 23rd through 26th. As Grant continued to press southeast, Lee responded by moving his army in the same direction, and the two armies raced for the North Anna River. Again, the Army of Northern Virginia was quicker and arrived on the south side of the river in time to impede a Federal crossing. Eventually, Meade's army forced its way across the river at 2 places, but they were walking into a trap. Lee had positioned his army in an inverted V formation between the 2 crossings with the tip of the river. The formation would enable Lee's army to fight a holding action on one side of the V while attacking on the other side. Fortunately for the rebels, Lee actually took ill during this process, and I mentioned this in the lead-up of the video, that Lee actually got sick during these 3 days, and the rebels never sprung the trap. Upon realizing his tenuous position, Grant had the army temporarily entrench and then march off to the southeast once again, ending the Battle of North Anna. And you'll see there some interesting photos. The first one, the top one, is a pontoon bridge. And the Union had gotten very good at setting up these pontoon bridges in a very short amount of time. They had engineers that would put the pontoons down, then lay the bridge across, and they could do it across almost any size river. And so they did get across in 2 different places, but as you saw, the Confederates were waiting for them. And you see a picture on the bottom side there, the army going across one of those pontoon bridges. Number 9, the Battle of Wilson's Wharf, May 24th, 1864, also called the Battle of Fort Pocahontas. This engagement took place at Charles City, Virginia. On May 24th, Confederate Major General Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry division of about 3,000 men attacked the Union supply depot at Wilson's Wharf and was repulsed by 2 black regiments under Brigadier General Edward Wild's 1,800 troops. The Union victor resulted in estimated total casualties of 165. See a picture there on the bottom left. Most of the Union troops on the Union side were African American soldiers, and they fought very valiantly that day, and they actually held that supply depot, and it was not captured by the Confederates. You see a plaque there from Fort Pocahontas talking about this very famous battle at Fort Pocahontas. Number 10, the Battle of Hawes Shop, May 28, 1864. On May 27th, Confederate forces intercepted Union cavalrymen as they attempted to cross the Pamunkey River at Dabney's Ferry and Crump's Creek. The following day, 2 Northern cavalry divisions commanded by Brigadier Generals Alfred Torbert and David Gregg engaged 2 Southern cavalry divisions commanded by Major General Wade Hampton and Major General Fitzhugh Lee. The Battle of Hawes Shop raged for 7 hours, with Yankees attempting to cross the Pamunkey River. Eventually, the rebel infantry arrived on the battlefield, reinforcing the Confederate position and repulsing the Federals, and they had to back out. And you can see there a battle map of the Hawes Shop battle and the Confederates who came up on the left and forced the Federals to retreat. But it started as a cavalry battle and then eventually devolved into an infantry battle, and the Federals had to leave. Number 11, Totopotomoy Creek, Bethesda Church, May 28th through 30th, 1864, also known as Crump's Creek, Shady Grove Road, and Hanover Town. These engagements took place in Hanover County. Operations along Totopotomoy Creek opened with cavalry combats at Pamunkey River crossing at Dabney's Ferry and Crump's Creek on May 27th. During the cavalry fight at Hawes Shop on May 28th, Union and Confederate infantry arrived in the vicinity. The Confederates entrenched behind Totopotomoy Creek. On the 29th, the Union 2nd, 9th, and 5th Corps probed General Robert E. Lee's position along the creek, while the 6th Corps found its way toward the Hanover County Courthouse. Early on the 30th, the 6th Corps turned south to come in on the far right flank of the Union line, but bogged down in the swampy Crump's Creek without getting into position. The Union 2nd Corps forced a crossing at Totopotomoy Creek in two places, capturing the first line of Confederate trenches. But the advance was stopped at the main line. The 9th Corps maneuvered into position on the left of the 2nd Corps, driving back Confederate pickets along the Shady Grove Road. In the meantime, the 5th Corps, moving near Bethesda Church on the left flank of the Union Army, was attacked by Early's Corps. A sharpshooter killed Confederate Brigadier General George Doles near Bethesda Church. The inconclusive battle resulted in an equal number of estimated casualties, both Union and Confederate, at about 1,100 men. And you see there's a really excellent book there called The Battle of Totopotomoy Creek, and there's a picture there of what one of the cannon would look like at this battle. These skirmishes continued all the way down the line, as you see. Number 12, the Battle of Old Church, May 30th, 1864, also took place in Hanover County. While the armies were stalemated along the Totopotomoy Creek line, Federal cavalry began probing east and south. Union Brigadier General Alfred Torbert's division attacked and defeated Confederate Brigadier General Matthew C. Butler's brigade near Old Church. Butler's troopers were driven steadily back on the road to Old Cold Harbor, opening the door for Union General Philip Sheridan's capture of the important crossroads the next day. The Union victory resulted in a total of about 900 casualties. Another view there of what the map looked like at the Battle of Old Church. You can see it was mostly a cavalry battle. Number 13, Federal bloodbath at Cold Harbor, May 31st to June 18th, 1864. Again, another more than 2-week battle here. We talked about this a little bit, and also the video mentioned how big this battle was. This is really the heartbeat of the entire campaign, with both armies entrenched for over 2 weeks. Grant's main objective at Cold Harbor, where he intended to link up with Union troops from the Army of the James. Again, Lee expected Grant's move, and he ordered his cavalry to hold Cold Harbor until his infantry arrived. And on May 31st, General Philip Sheridan's Union cavalry seized vital crossroads at Cold Harbor from the Confederates, which was only 8 miles from Richmond. The next day, Sheridan repulsed a counterattack by rebel infantry trying to recover that position. By June 2nd, both armies had arrived at Cold Harbor and entrenched along a front that extended for 7 miles. On June 3rd, Grant ordered an ill-advised frontal assault on the Confederate lines. Grant suffered serious casualties at the Battle of Cold Harbor and lost nearly 7,000 men, compared to 1,500 rebel casualties. Grant later commented in his memoirs that this was the only attack he wished he had never ordered. For the next 10 days, the two armies continued to confront each other until Grant abandoned his strategy of attacking Lee's army at Cold Harbor. So this was really the big one. This one, Appomattox, and the Wilderness were the 3 major battles of this campaign. Number 14, the Battle of Trevilian Station. This happened on June 11th, 1864. Sheridan's men engaged Confederate cavalry divisions commanded by Major General Wade Hampton in the Trevilian Station. Initially, the Yankees divided the Confederate force, but the tide shifted the next day when the rebel troopers dismounted and repulsed several Union assaults. Federal soldiers destroyed about 6 miles of railroad track before the Confederates forced them to withdraw and return east, ending the Battle of Trevilian Station. So the goal here by the Union was they were continuing to try to chip away at the railroad tracks that were all around Richmond. And they actually were successful in this situation. They got rid of 6 miles of that railroad track before the Confederates could push them back. There's a really excellent book there called The Battle of Trevilian Station that talks about the Union strategy to try to chip away at those railroad tracks to cut off the supply lines for the Confederates. Number 15, on to Petersburg. So on June 12, 1864, Grant evacuated Cold Harbor and moved Meade's army across the James River to begin the assault on Petersburg, which was a crucial supply depot for Richmond and Lee's army located south of Richmond. The last official action of the campaign took place when rebel and federal cavalry units skirmished near St. Mary's Church in Charles City on June 24th. And you can see a picture there of St. Mary's Church cavalry battle that happened right at the end of this campaign. You can see a map there of all the different forays that the Union was trying, and in each case got rebuffed by the Confederates. This was the first time they had been successful in getting around the Confederate flank and getting all the way to Petersburg. Number 16, Battle of St. Mary's Church. We just mentioned it there, June 24th. Wade Hampton's men intercepted 2 brigades of Philip Sheridan's cavalry, commanded by Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg, at St. Mary's Church in Charles City, Virginia. The Federals fought a brief holding action, allowing their supply chain to escape the Confederates. Gregg's men then withdrew, bringing the battle to a conclusion. The Battle of St. Mary's Church, also known as Battle of Nance's Shop, was the final battle of Grant's Overland Campaign. And there's a little marker there if you ever go to this area and go to St. Mary's Church, and it talks about how the church was literally right in the middle of both sides of this battle. And there was actually quite a bit of damage on the church that had to be repaired later. You can see a scene there of what a cavalry battle might have looked like coming out of that St. Mary's Church engagement. Number 17, Overland Campaign was a long-awaited matchup between Grant and Lee. Grant had been operating in the Western Theater in Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee during the first 3 years of the war. He was therefore tapped to be commander of all U.S. forces by Lincoln in 1864, and he was given full power of all forces to bring an end to the war. Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant had been friends and colleagues at West Point in college, had served together in the Mexican-American War, so they knew each other well. The Overland Campaign was the first time Grant and Lee faced off against each other directly on the battlefield. And the first battle was at the Wilderness, just outside of Chancellorsville, where Lee had his greatest victory in 1863. And there's a picture of the two of them there. And also this is coming from a very excellent TV series. Highly recommend you check out if you have some time. It's actually shown on the History Channel and a couple of other channels, called Grant versus Lee, the Overland Campaign, 1864. Really excellent TV show. Number 18, Grant planned 5 separate campaigns to be executed all at once, overwhelming the Confederate Army. So as we mentioned, this was a real difference compared to earlier in the war, where they wanted to create a campaign that was a nonstop fighting situation for, it ended up being 40 days, but as long as it would take to get the Confederates to back down. Grant's main objective was defeating Lee with the Overland Campaign, and he also planned simultaneous campaigns to put down the Confederacy. These included campaigns in the Trans-Mississippi, the Shenandoah Valley, the James River east of Richmond, a major campaign against Atlanta led by Grant's trusted subordinate, General William T. Sherman. Although Grant suffered severe losses during the Overland Campaign, it was a strategic Union victory. It inflicted proportionally higher losses on Lee's army and maneuvered it into a siege at Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia, in just over 8 weeks. So although he took heavy losses, this campaign was successful. He was able to achieve what he wanted to do. And then in addition, he had all these other Union generals off marching in other locations, and the Confederates couldn't defend against it. You can see a picture there on the bottom left of Atlanta burning. After Sherman got there, he burned Atlanta to the ground. Number 19, Grant was named the Butcher after the Overland Campaign due to the high level of casualties on both sides. Very famous picture there of Grant on the top right, leaning against a tree next to his headquarters tent. And there's a real good book you should check out there called On to Petersburg, which talks about Grant and Lee and all the strategies that they employed during the second half of the Overland Campaign from June 4th to the 15th. Because of the high number of casualties during the Overland Campaign, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant developed a reputation as a butcher. The Overland Campaign's high casualty rates and horrific battle conditions shocked war-weary Northerners. The newspapers had turned against him in the North, and popularity for the long conflict, which was about to enter year 5. The Overland Campaign ended when Grant stopped pursuing Lee's army to destroy it and shifted his strategy to capturing the strategically important southern cities of Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia. So he briefly changed his strategy from holding territory to this chasing Lee strategy that he did for essentially 6 weeks. And then he switched back when he captured Petersburg and Richmond to a holding those cities hostage campaign. Number 20, Grant's strategy was to cut Lee off from reinforcements and supplies and destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. So he ordered General Franz Sigel, who's there on the top left, to advance down the Shenandoah Valley to prevent reinforcements and supplies from reaching Lee's army. Grant also ordered Benjamin F. Butler, who's there on the bottom, and his Union Army of the James to cut off the rail lines between Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia. And he did so. He actually removed many of the track lines that were in between those two cities. This interrupted Lee's main supply line. Grant wanted to force Lee to attack even though Lee had no reinforcements and few supplies. So you can see all the different strategies Grant had laid in place before this campaign. They were all coming to fruition. Number 21, Grant decided to change his strategy mid-campaign from destroy Lee's army to drive to Petersburg and Richmond at the meeting of his top generals and officers. And we just mentioned that he had changed strategies towards the end of this campaign. You can see a picture of him sitting there up against the tree in a chair. And he's surrounded by all of his top officers and generals and lieutenants. And this was a huge meeting towards the end of this campaign where they were deciding what to do next. And he discussed with his generals, and they came out of this meeting with, let's go take Petersburg, and then let's take Richmond. That was the strategy. Let's not pursue Lee anymore. We've done enough damage, and now we just need to go hold those two cities. Number 22, Lincoln trusted Ulysses S. Grant because he was a fighter. As the Civil War dragged towards its fourth year in March 1864, Abraham Lincoln prepared to place his faith and his election year prospects in the hands of yet another military commander. Repeatedly frustrated by generals such as McClellan, Meade, and others who had failed to pursue Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the president finally believed he had found his right man to take the fight to the enemy, and that was Ulysses S. Grant, the hero of the West who had conquered Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga. Lincoln had long admired Grant's aggression and resisted calls for his ouster after a poor performance at the 1862 Battle of Shiloh. By firing back, "I can't spare this man, he fights." The president gave Grant command of all Union armies, a force that numbered more than 500,000 men, and elevated him to lieutenant general, a rank not given to a wartime commander since George Washington, the American Revolution. So you can imagine what an honor this was to be given that rank, lieutenant general, which nobody in our history had had, except for George Washington. Number 23, the attack on Petersburg, Virginia turned into a 9-month siege. On June 12th, Grant's forces crossed the James River to Petersburg, where a 9-month siege ensued. The 6-week Overland Campaign had ended, leaving behind numbing losses. The dead, missing, and wounded totaled 55,000 for the Union, 33,000 for the Confederacy. According to the Civil War Trust, Spotsylvania Courthouse, 30,000 combined casualties, and the Wilderness, 29,800 casualties, were the third and fourth bloodiest battles of the Civil War, trailing only Gettysburg and Chickamauga. Through the carnage, Lincoln had never lost faith in his new commander. As the Union forces dug in around Petersburg, Grant received a telegram from the commander-in-chief. "I begin to see it. You will succeed. God bless you all. A. Lincoln." And you see a couple of pictures there. The top left is the siege at Petersburg and some of the action that happened there. And you can see a picture there on the bottom, some of the Union officers around one of their cannon at this siege. Number 24, outcome of the Overland Campaign. Well, the outcome was a strategic success for the North. By pounding the Army of Northern Virginia, Grant hindered Southern efforts to send reinforcements to halt the other Union campaigns of Philip Sheridan in Shenandoah Valley, William T. Sherman in Georgia. In addition, although the Federals suffered higher casualties, the Confederacy could not replace their losses as readily as the North. Finally, by threatening Petersburg and ultimately Richmond, Grant tied down the Army of Northern Virginia, limiting Lee's military options for the rest of the war. You can see a really excellent book there called The Overland Campaign. Highly recommend. It's a really well-written book. Speaking of books, there are many great books around the Overland Campaign. There were so many different battles and amazing things that happened during these 40 days. You can see here it was been written about a lot. Another Overland Campaign book there on the left. There's one called From the Rapidan to Petersburg, one called Command Conflicts in Grant's Overland Campaign, Cold Harbor to the Crater, Grant and Lee, the Overland Campaign, the Wilderness Campaign, If It Takes All Summer, which is a quote directly from Grant. After the first couple of days at the Battle of Spotsylvania, he essentially said, if it takes all summer. And then To the North Anna River. So these are all really excellent books. I actually went to Barnes & Noble and spent some time paging through these, and was really impressed. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you learned something about the Overland Campaign. It's not a very well-known aspect of the Civil War. It really was as the war was winding down. This was Grant's attempt at a death blow to the Confederacy, and he essentially succeeded. First by the 40 days of brutal fighting all the way down the James River, the Rappahannock River, the Potomac River, and all the way down to Petersburg. After those 40 days were over, the Confederates were limping severely, were cut off from their supplies, had no men to reinforce, were desperately trying to save their capital, and really their ability to fight after that was very limited. The siege actually also starved a lot of the people of Petersburg out and ended up having to come out and be hostages. So you can see it was a very interesting campaign. It did deal the death blow that Grant thought it would. And while he was keeping the Army of Northern Virginia occupied during this Overland Campaign, and they did fight valiantly on both sides, you saw there were other generals in other areas of the country that were making huge inroads to taking down the Confederacy and getting rid of the last bastions of resistance. So hopefully you enjoyed that and you learned a lot. I hope you learned to study some more about the Overland Campaign. It really was fascinating. Each of the individual battles were really fascinating. There was a lot of interesting things that happened at each one strategically. And hopefully you spent some time studying it and looking at over some of the books that I showed you there. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We look forward to bringing you this content every week, and really enjoy all the comments that you've been sending to us. Thank you very much for the feedback. And as always, hope you love history as much as we do. Have a great evening.